Hey, it's Video Bob, and today we're going to talk about generators. Now, this is my 1990 Prevost XL, and this is, for the most part, the generator that came with it in 1990. But we've upgraded the generator head. So let's talk about the engine a little bit. This system was originally put in here by Martin Diesel Power Systems back in 1989 and 90. For this coach, which was built by Angola. Now, your coach may have who knows what in it, because there are so many coach builders out there. There's Marathon, there's Liberty, and then there's a gazillion others that are out of business, just like Angola. So what companies like Martin do is they buy an engine and a generator head, mate them together, build a control system so that you can operate them, and then maybe they'll also build this little slide mechanism. This is a little tray that's on a drawer so you can pull it out. As you see, I have it pulled out. The way this thing works is it's got a couple of things that make it different than just pushing a generator in here. For instance, there are three basic generators you'll find in RVs, coaches, and buses. Now, for a while in the 80s, they experimented with low-pressure gas propane generators. You'll find those in like 4 travels. So they'll take basically a genset like an Onan and have it run on propane. The problem with that is that propane's kind of hard to get. You can't just get that anywhere. You have to go find it, and you're limited to maybe 2-3 day supply of propane. Now, the advantages of it is it burns much cleaner, cooler. There's no carburetor junk to deal with. And they're really good generators, but they're a real pain in the ass. The second from that would be a gasoline generator, which would normally, you would find, the only kind of buses that are going to run on gasoline are not going to be Prevost buses like these or Eagles. Those are going to be like Bluebirds, Wonder Lodges, school buses, custom conversions, GMCs, usually where they have the motor up front, and then they put the generator somewhere in the back, which isn't a great idea. And those just run on gasoline. And those are usually air-cooled and have an exhaust that just vents right out the side. Then you get into the diesel generators. Now, the engine in here is basically what you would find in a small John Deere or Ditch Witch or other hydraulically operated type of piece of farm equipment or something. This is a Yanmar engine, a Japanese motor. This is a 3-cylinder version. They come in a 2, a 3, and a 4. This is a 3-cylinder, fuel injected. This one has a turbo, and there's an oiler that runs up here to oil the turbo. The turbo exhaust then has a flexi exhaust that runs to another fan that then connects it to a muffler that sends it 30 feet all the way out the back, which is great because it's super quiet. So you're venting your generator exhaust all the way out the back where the regular tailpipe is. Great idea. Super quiet. There's no fumes around here. This thing is also water cooled. So to water cool it, what they have is these water pipes run way to the middle of the bus. And what they did was they took the radiator and they put it flat, facing the road. And on top of the radiator is a squirrel cage fan, just like you would have on your home HVAC internal air conditioning cooler. And that squirrel cage spins around. It has a little starter motor on it, and it is powered directly from the generator. So when you fire up the generator, it automatically feeds 110 to that fan and cools off that radiator. And there's a fuel pump that's built into this timing cover that's gear operated. So you never have to worry about that going out. Well, actually, I'm wrong. This one is belt operated. I'm wrong about that. So it's the fuel pump that's gear operated. I'm sorry. So anyway, you have a water pump, you have an alternator, and just one basic belt that runs this thing. It has its own starting battery that's completely separate from the motor coach batteries or the house batteries. So it's a self-contained system, which is great. The only thing it shares with the bus is its fuel supply. On the on your Prevost buses, this center bay usually, this is a 40, so you only have 1, 2, 3, 4 bays. and you'd have 5 on the 45. But this one with the vents, this is part of the heating and air conditioning system of the bus. There's a big, heat exchanger here and one on the other side. In between that is your fuel tank. Now, on your smaller entertainer coaches, you're going to have the standard 110 tank. This one has an extended tank. This particular coach, being an RV, holds 260 gallons of diesel. Now, these generators operate using about a gallon an hour at full blast, which means you can run this thing for almost 2 weeks straight and never get out of the bus without running out of gas. So, this being an RV and not an entertainer coach, you've got a much bigger fuel supply and a much bigger water supply. Like I said, I can take this thing out, boondock it, meaning not hooked up to anything, and just sit there on my own tires and not exit the door for 10 days easily, and I'm fine. That's what's so great about these coaches. This is the difference between an RV and a real bus. With an RV, even the high-end ones, the Ford Travels and all these other ones, they're going to take an Onan, which is now owned by Cummins. Those are a self-contained unit, and it's self-contained, meaning the exhaust system, the cooling system, everything is just all built right into itself, which is great. But those are very expensive, and they're a little bit harder to maintain, a little bit harder to get to. The thing about an engine like this is they use these things on, like out in the oil fields and places where they might put this generator out there hooked up to a tanker full of fuel and let it run for months at a time, operating oil derricks and things. They're just some of the most robust motors that there are in the world. Now, let's talk about their lifespan and the maintenance. This motor is 30 years old. It's 28 years old. This recording is in 2018. This bus was built late 89, 1990, somewhere in there. And this motor probably has 10 or 12,000 hours on it. I'm not exactly sure how many hours it has on it because the gauge that was on it had X amount of hours, and I don't know how many times it had been rebuilt before that. So we decided we wanted to rebuild this engine. We pulled it out of here, took it apart, replaced the rings, all the bearings, all of the seals, all of those things, painted it, and I used a silver barbecue paint. It's a high heat paint made to go, 600 degrees. The thing never gets more than about 180 degrees, so it's really not a problem. But we spray painted it with silver barbecue paint to make it look pretty. And we decided to change out the generator head. Now, the generator head that was on here was made by a company that's no longer existing. I think it was called the International Pancake or something like that. It was a 12.5 kilowatt motor, and I wanted something a little bit more robust. So you see that this one doesn't match. We didn't paint it. Now this one they're made in China. They're really basic brushless generators, and they come in a couple of different configurations. This one was by Central Generator of Georgia. You can find them on eBay and just Google them. Really, it is the most simple generator you're going to find. This one's a 16.5 watt generator, so an upgrade from the one I have. So what you're going to want to check before you put one of these on is a couple of things. You want to look up the model number of your motor and find out what its horsepower rating is. Mine having a turbo on it, it puts out about 25 horsepower. That's not a lot, but for a diesel it is, because it's a tremendous amount of torque. These motors, a diesel motor, as you know, doesn't really run very high. They only run about 2,000 RPMs. I think the fastest that a diesel motor can go is, I want to say 2250 or 2300 RPM, something like that. So the generator is asked to be set at an RPM of 1800 RPMs. You may have to adjust that slightly to get exactly the output you want. And how you do that is by hooking up, if you have a quality meter that gives you hertz here in the United States, you're going to want to get 60 hertz. So as long as you're getting exactly 60 hertz, which will produce 120 volts, you know that you have the correct RPM. So what you're going to want to do is when you install this, turn the RPMs down on your motor just in case. Once you've installed the unit and it's running and it's outputting power, turn your RPMs up to just the point where you're getting the correct hertz you want. Then turn on everything that you can, put the biggest load on it that you can, and then see what your hertz are. And you may need to add a little RPM for that. If you're going a few hertz higher or lower, it's not going to kill anything. You're running 62 hertz or 59, it's not going to really make that big a difference. You know, some sensitive electronics might have an issue with it, but we're going to talk about that later. If you're putting in modern TVs and things like that, you're going to want to have power conditioners and UPS systems on all of those. The way we'll talk about this later, but the way most of these coaches are set up, all of those kind of electronics are running through sine wave inverters that are getting their power from 12 volts. So it's a really weird system. If you're familiar with trains are electric powered, but they have diesel motors that power the electric generators that run the electrical motors that operate them. The internal electrical system of these buses run in much the same way. The generator is putting out power that the inverters use to charge the batteries to run themselves, and that runs all the electronics. However, the direct 220 coming off the generator is running your big appliances, like your rooftop air conditioners, water heaters, stuff like that. Stuff that's not going to really be affected by, you don't have to have a sine wave direct 120 or 240 volts for that. It can take a little up and down because it's just running motors and compressors. So anyway, get back to talking about how this thing is. When you contact Central Georgia Generator to get your generator head, they're going to want to know a couple of things. They're going to want to know what the horsepower of your motor is and what is your bell housing. So let's go back to Martin Diesel, what we were talking about earlier. You can buy this Yanmar motor for probably about $3,000 to $4,000 if you wanted to build your own generator from scratch. The trick here, though, is the bell housing that connects the motor to the generator here is this piece in the middle that is much like a transmission bell housing, right, with a flywheel in it. Now, this particular unit uses what's called an SAE4. When you contact Central Georgia Generator, they're going to give you some tips on how to measure your bell housing of your motor to figure out which one of these that you need. This one's an SAE4. They tell you how to measure that. There's several different SAE versions. And it was really, really simple to mate them together. You take this grill off, you reach up in there, there's some bolts, you tighten the bolts. This thing went together lickety-split. My mechanic had this thing together. I came in there and it was done, and I said, how did you do that? And he goes, it was so easy. And that's really all there is to it. Because once this thing starts, all it needs to do is spin. They don't talk to each other, okay? Motor's operating, this thing's putting out power. It doesn't get any simpler, okay? Now, we'll talk about kind of how I wired this thing. I wanted it to be extremely simple. I didn't want to modify the box. Normally, when you get something like the way Martin Diesel did it, they put the breakers and the plugs and the hour meter right into the casing of this. I didn't want to modify the casing of this in case I had a warranty issue, in case I needed to return it. So I did it the most simple way possible. I went down to Home Depot, and I bought an RV outlet box. And come over here and you can get a little shot of this. This, if you've ever docked at a campground, this is a box that you would find on a pole. It would normally have a lid. It's got a 50 amp plug here and a 20 amp 110 plug there. This is called a 70 amp RV output box. So the way my generator was hooked up before is they just had a 50 amp plug that just plugged into it. The same plug you use to dock to, the same one plugs right into here. So what we did was we just screwed this box to the top of this lid and wired straight through the knockout right into it. It was so simple, it wasn't funny. It only cost us maybe $10 worth of materials and wire, not counting the box. The box was $90. We got $100 wiring this thing up. Spent another $15 or $20 on this little hour meter. And what was great is the hour meter just happened to fit in the top head hole that would normally, the hole was already there. We just stuffed it in there. We had to notch it out just a tiny bit, but it was really easy to put that hour meter in there. And, you're going to want to replace the hour meter every time you do a full overhaul of the engine. All right, so let's talk about the maintenance a little bit. Question people ask all the time, when should I change the oil on my generator? You really want to look at the manual. But if you don't have the manual and you're just going by the seat of your pants putting this together, it's really kind of up to you and the weather and how hard you've used it. If you've been cruising around in July, you got all your air conditioners burning, this thing is banging away at full blast, full torque, you're going to blacken the oil pretty quick. In those cases, I like to change my oil every 100 hours, all right? or at least every 4 or 5 days. But if you're rolling around and it's nice cool weather, the thing's just idling, you're barely using the electricity, you can go a couple of weeks. It's really up to you checking the oil. The way we've designed this motor is we added a ball valve to the bottom down there. I put an emergency cap just in case. We have a ball valve there. I bought a piece of 1/2-inch pipe that I screw into it. I put a jug under it. I open the valve. I drain the oil right after I've turned it off. As soon as I park and I'm docked, I drain the oil while it's nice and hot and super thin. Oil comes out. It holds about 1.5 gallons of oil, maybe less. Now, what kind of oil? Well, that really is up to the motor that you use, but chances are it's going to use just regular old diesel oil, which is 1540. I like to use Delo 400. And if you have a Prevost bus, we'll talk about this later, but the 8V92 series, the Detroit diesel series, has to use a low ash straight 40. And actually, you'll find that a lot of people like to use that same oil in this motor, and that's perfectly fine. Because with the exception of the few people living in Alaska, Canada, and the upper part of the United States that are living in the super cold climates, everybody else is going to want to use the thicker oil. If you just happen to live up in the middle of nowhere and where it's below zero all the time, then you're going to want to use those lighter weights. But here, for instance, here in Texas, we want the thicker weight. Quite frankly, I don't think it would be that bad if you put a 2050 in there. Thicker the better when you're running hot. I'm traveling from Dallas through Arizona, Las Vegas, LA, and back, going through the Southwest. Very thin air, very hot, very low humidity, and in those cases, I'll usually put in a little thickener. Sometimes I'll put in like a Bardol no smoke to help thicken the oil, because it's a diesel. It's only going to run 180 degrees, but it helps with the compression, and you can hear it. Anybody who's been around motors for a long time, you can hear when the motor's banging a little. Now, there's a lot of debate whether or not these oil additives are any good. I personally will attest to the use of Z-Max and also Slick 50 Prolong. Every time I do an oil change, I put a different one in. I'll tell you, before we did the rebuild on this thing, I had filled this thing up with Z-Max, and the reason we did a rebuild is my front main seal between the two failed, and all the oil came out, and this thing was running with no oil, basically, had very little in it, and it did well. So I recommend these oil additives. Now, one of the things about these motors I just mentioned, they have several sensors in them. They have an oil temperature sensor, a oil pressure sensor, and a water temperature. Some of them don't have an oil temperature, but they do have an oil pressure and a water temperature. So what'll happen is, if it overheats, it'll shut itself off. If it has low oil pressure, it'll shut itself off. There's a solenoid valve here that will choke it and turn it off. It's the same one that's used to just turn it off when you turn it off. Something that might happen is you go around a corner real hard, and all the oil slashes over to one side or whatever, and it'll trigger this thing and turn it off. That's happened before. Don't let that scare you. Let me tell you a quick little story about something to never do. On my previous coach, which was a Ford Travel, had a Onan diesel generator in it. It had a bad sensor in it, and every time I made a hard turn, it killed the generator. But I couldn't. Whenever it did that, it would trigger a reset switch, and I'd have to come out, open the bay, crawl in there, press the button, and start it again. It was a pain in the ass. So you know what my dumb ass did? I zip-tied the automatic closer so that it wouldn't shut off. Let me tell you why that was a gigantic mistake. Because we did a trip from Dallas to New York, which is really relevant to the story. But the morning before I was about to leave to the event we were going to, I changed the oil because I knew we were going to be boondocking for 3 days. And somehow the cap had accidentally come off, and the oil came out on the way over to the gig, which was only 30 minutes away. By the time I got there, and I pulled into the event, the generator was like bang, 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 and smoke was shooting out the side. I didn't know it at the time because when you're driving, you can't hear it. Well, had I not zip-tied the emergency shutdown, it would have just turned itself off. But since it didn't know to turn itself off, the engine exploded. It was dead. It was gone. And that was a $6,000 mistake, because that's how much I had to pay to buy a used replacement of that 7,500 watt generator. That zip tie cost me $6,000. So, don't ever do that. Just a word of advice from somebody who's been there. All right. Yanmars are pretty interesting. Here's the thing. You may look at your generator, and you're not going to see necessarily these names I've mentioned, because other companies like Kubota or all these, there's all these different companies, and they'll put their own name on there. But at the end of the day, chances are it's a Yanmar. This is probably one of the most used motors. So like you might have a Ditch Witch, you might have a John Deere or whatever, and it's actually a Yanmar motor. Because it's Japanese, you have to order the parts for it usually from Japan. So that can be time consuming. So what I recommend is going ahead and ordering everything that you might ever need for this. All the seals, the gaskets and everything. You may spend as much as $600 on all that stuff, but you should have it and have it in stock. Simple things like the banjo fitting that fits on the oiler of this turbo was a special order item from Japan. We couldn't find one. So those little things, if you're smart, you'll have. Always make sure you carry 2 belts. 2 belts, always carry those. Check your hoses often, every time you change your oil, and make sure that none of them are rubbing against anything and creating a hole. Figure out which air cleaner you have. Get a couple of them. The oil filter for this, I get it like Napa, right? I keep a dozen of them on hand at any time. Because make sure you clean this fuel filter out too. That can cause a lot of problems. But just make sure you carry these things with you. Carry extra hose clamps. Maybe if you have extra hoses. If you have space for this stuff and you're going to go on a long trip, you should carry this stuff. Because if you have a simple failure, something very simple, you can't just necessarily run down to Napa or wherever and get the part that you need. So that's really important. I'm trying to think if I missed anything here. I've had this coach now a couple of years. I've been a coach owner for a lot of times. I'm one of the administrators of the Prevost Owners Group on Facebook, and I encourage you to come on there and ask questions. There's me and Gil, and there's a lot of great resources there for people to find out anything you want to know. These Firestone airbags should be lifetime. They should last a lifetime. If yours are leaking, it's probably just the valve stem. We recently replaced those valve stems. But you can buy them, I think retail, they're $100 a piece. I've seen them as low as $30 a piece. You definitely want to keep those aired up. You don't want this thing sitting down flat, because these airbags not only help quiet it in the coach, but help prevent itself from rattling itself to death. Let's talk about the insides. You definitely want to make sure you don't have any exhaust leaks. Exhaust going up in the cabin will kill you in your sleep. So we'll talk about this later when we go in the coach on another video, but make sure that you have both smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, and put one in your bedroom and whatnot, because a lot of people have died over something so stupid as, the exhaust rattled apart, this is underneath, smoke goes directly up into the cabin, you die in your sleep. Weird Al Yankovic's parents died this way, if you're a fan of Weird Al, over something stupid like that. So it's really important that you check all those things. That little gasket between the exhaust and the turbo could kill you. So you want to make sure that when this thing is running, stick your face over there and see if you smell any gas. It should be coming out, or exhaust should be coming out the back. Let's talk about the padding in here. We recently redid all the padding in here. There's actually 2 levels of padding on the inside. We used an adhesive foil padding on the inside that is used in the hoods and trunks of cars. It's an high heat insulation. Then the sound deadening material was put on top of that, and the important thing is to get high heat flame retardant versions of that material. Make sure that it's high heat flame retardant, won't burn, won't melt, because it's in a hot box of oil. The thing could catch on fire. So those are some important things. Anyway, I highly recommend the Central Georgia Generator guys. And I hope I'm saying that right. I forget if it's Central Generator Georgia or Central Georgia Generator, whatever. Google them. And they were really helpful. What they're going to do is they'll ship you this thing on a pallet, a very small pallet, and it's using an engine hoist. It was really easy to put these together. So if you're refurbishing an old generator or you want to build one from scratch, if you're doing your own bus conversion, for instance, and this is something we'll talk about in another video. I keep saying that. But if you're one of the guys that wants to build your own conversion where you've gotten a good deal on an old Greyhound or a passenger bus, a shuttle bus, and you're going to strip the interior, but they didn't put generators in those buses because they didn't need them, and you want to put a generator in the bus, you got a couple of options. You can buy an off-the-shelf gasoline generator and put it in a separate tank, or an off-the-shelf diesel generator and put that in there, but it's not going to last you that long. If you want one that literally can just run forever, you got to think, the guys that are entertainer buses, that I used to drive a tour bus, we would go out for 3 months at a time, and I didn't turn the generator off for more than a couple of minutes, so I could change oil. I'd change oil once a week or something, but it ran all the time, unless we were plugged in. But usually when you go to a venue, you can't plug in. You have to run the generator all the time. So like for 3 months straight, the generator ran. You know what I mean? This is the kind of torture you can put a motor like this through. So if you wanted to build your own, you can get this. I think I paid, I want to say $1,600 for the generator head. That's nothing, right? And you could buy the engine for $3 to $4 grand, right? So if you were to go to one of these other high-end generator manufacturers, you might spend $20,000 on a rig like this. It's way expensive. But if you know how to weld, and you can make your own little tray, and you can mate these two together, and you can kind of copy what they've done here, you could put this whole system together for, let's say, $5,000 or $6,000. Now that's a lot of money, but we're talking about a $500,000 coach. If $5,000 or $6,000 is kicking your ass, you are in the wrong hobby. Because let me tell you, I've probably got $5,000 or $6,000 in the rebuild and refresh of this generator, and I think that was a great bargain, because to go buy a used 16,000 watt generator from an RV supply, I don't think I could get out of there for less than 10 grand. There's no way. So this is a video I wanted to make about my Yanmar generator with the Central Georgia Generator from China. Brushless generator, extremely simple. I'm not even going to bother talking about how simple it was. There was 4 posts. You got 120 leg, 120 leg, 2. That was it. That's it. So if you know anything about electricity, put the two together, you got a 240. Done. We had this thing wired up and running, and I was on my way and did a gig within hours of. We had this thing hooked up and running in no time at all. It was just way too simple. And I want to rewind just a little bit. How we ended up with this thing is, after we did the rebuild, the original pancake generator that I had on there, after we installed it, something had happened to the windings or something, and it wasn't putting out power. Now, if you ever run into that situation, I'll try and touch on this a little bit. If your generator's putting out less than 6 volts without the voltage regulator, it's toast. We were putting out 2 volts. There's a voltage regulator in here, which, by the way, you can get for like $35 off of eBay. When you go to these generator supply places, they may charge you $350 for the thing. Total ripoff. You can buy a voltage regulator for one of these things for under $100 all day long. And the way they work is basically they sample electricity that's coming out of the main windings. They read that reading, and it sends it back into the controller and tells the generator to excite its field and to output. You can trick your voltage regulator into working in situations where you've had the thing taken apart and somehow your field has been lost or reverse magnetized. And if you Google this, you'll find it. But you apply 12 volts to the leads of the voltage regulator. It excites the field, fixes the reverse polarity, and then it starts putting out voltage again. You can trick a generator into working again. But we were having trouble with the other one, and we just couldn't get it to work. So we decided it was way better just to buy one of these. Now, in the instruction manual of this thing, he warned, do not run this thing higher than its suggested 1800 RPMs because it will overpower and could explode. The reason you put that in there is for some yahoo that might hook this thing up to a gasoline engine. Bad idea. Don't hook it up to a gasoline engine. I mean, I thought about it. I mean, I've got a 4-cylinder Volvo motor sitting, that was in a crash car, and I thought, hey, that would make a good generator. But you know what? Gas engines run up to 6,000 RPMs, and they don't have the same amount of torque. Diesels only run about 2,000 RPMs. About 2,200 is as fast as they're going to go before they just blow themselves up. Maybe 2,500 for some units. This thing running at 1,800 RPMs, it's as fast as it's going to go. And that's where you want this thing to be. But you really need to, it really comes down to how many cylinders is in your motor. If you got a 2-cylinder or a 4-cylinder. Idealistically, if you have a 4-cylinder version of one of these, you're probably putting out as much as 30 horsepower, maybe a little more, and you could kick up to the 22,000 voltage one, which you're probably not going to need on this type of coach. Now, on the really big 45-foot coaches, the new modern ones where everything is just, they've got basement air, they will sometimes put 2 of these in a bay facing each other, right? Where you'd have a bay that goes all the way through, and you have a generator here and a generator on the other side, and you have 2 25,000 watts, and they're running 50,000 watts at 100 amps, which is just batshit crazy. I don't know why anybody would need that much power, but some of those newer coaches need that much power. But your average Prevost, if you're talking about an older Prevost, an XL40, the El Mirage, 16,000 watts is more than you're going to need. That's running 3 air conditioners, electric water heater, microwaves, flat top stove, chargers. It's running everything fine. And when we fire this thing up on our electrical panel, we're getting exactly 120 volts. And with everything running, I'm only pulling about 35 to 40 amps. And this is about 62 amps worth of output. So I'm doing great. Anyway, I know this was a really long video, but for the people who watch these videos, this is one of the biggest investments you're going to make in your life. And this is something that's really, really important. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If you don't have $10,000 in cash in your pocket or in your safe, don't leave the house in one of these buses. Maybe 5 and some credit cards. But if you're ever in a situation where you absolutely are in an emergency and you need to replace a generator or a transmission or a major steering component or maybe even a motor or whatever, you're going to want to have $5,000 to $10,000 in cash. If you can't afford to do that, you have no business driving one of these coaches. So let me scare you into that. Because there's been times, just like when my last generator failed, that if you don't have that kind of money handy to work on these, you're going to be sorry. You're going to be on the side of the road. The other thing is, make sure to have good SAM roadside assistance. I've had them pull me out of the mud. One time I had my Allison transmission computer it didn't fry. It just lost its ROM and wouldn't shift and operate. And I had to be towed. And whenever they tow one of these things, they have to pull the drive shafts out in order to pull it. And that tow would have cost me $1,000 just to be towed 15 miles in Memphis, when in reality, it cost me nothing because of Sam's good good Sam. And all they did was flash. They charged me $600 just to reflash the computer, and then it shifted properly and it worked fine. That wasn't on this bus. This was on a 4-travel, but the 4-travel used the exact same system. Had a 6V92 with the same transmission. So we'll talk about all that later. Anyway, this is my generator, and it goes right back in there like that, and it fires up. Well, actually, we've got it turned off, but anyway, great working rig. and this is how it goes. So thanks for watching the video. Appreciate it.